Welcome to the Model Rail Replacement Podcast, helping you get to your onward journey. A friendly service that helps you get from A to B, or probably nowhere at all.
Hello and welcome to the Model Rail Replacement Podcast. We like to call it MERP. You like to listen, hopefully. And here we are. I'm your host, James, and with me is co-host and producer.
Sam, good morning, everyone.
Hello, Sam. How are we?
I'm good. I'm really good actually. Hobby wise, I've not necessarily done a lot of it. I've been working on a few customer projects, and I've also been working on my Mark II Network Southeast coach repaints that I've been doing for about 18 months, but that's slow progress. But otherwise, I'm happy. I'm in a good mood. I'm ready for the weekend, to be really honest with you, which makes no sense when this comes out on a Monday. How are you?
I can't wait for the weekend to begin. I'm all right, yeah. What have I been doing? What have I been doing? Mostly 009, I think. Yeah, a bit more progress on the first module board of the 009 build. Not much. I got the wiring done. I think I may have got the wiring done last time and tested it and ran things. Yeah, I did actually. Yeah, we got that far. I don't know. I've had some bits of wood. Actually, I haven't done much at all thinking about it.
You've been
I've got,
you've been
got a
editing a lot of
back on
videos
it and
though,
a bit of wood on the front for the river. That's as much as I think I've done.
which makes no sense to anybody who's listening to this in chronological order because at the point of us recording, you've had episode 2 come out so far. So everyone's like, "What?"
Oh yeah. No, well, I think I do advise in the videos that they are recorded long before they come out. So yeah, the second episode of the 009 build came out on at the time of recording came out today. Um, but yeah, oh, I've been building a little narrow boat actually.
Ooh.
Um, yeah, I picked up a kit from the model shop in Northampton, and the reason I picked up a narrow boat is we've got something coming in the future. I don't want to say too much just yet, but it's a JS Models canal lock I will be working on, who are kindly sent it for me to have a go at and review. And our listeners just might be able to get something out of it too, but they'll have to keep listening to find out. So that's all I can really say about that for now.
Speaking of that, you have reminded me, and this is difficult because we're trying to do this so that it all works in the time frames. At the point of listening to this, you have lost any chance of entering our t-shirt competition because it closed the second this episode came out. So if you didn't enter the t-shirt competition, you've lucked out. If you did enter the t-shirt competition, James and I are going to be working out who the winners will be over the course of this week, and you will find out in next week's episode who the winners were.
Yeah. And if it happens to be Tom from Buggles Kelly or Steve the British Railroader or Danny at various multiple units, it's not a fix. They just happen to win it. All right. I'm just putting that out there. I did say to Sam, can people that close to the show enter the competition? But he seemed to think it was fine. So, if it's my brother or my dad, it's just the way that magic wheel on the internet works.
It definitely has nothing to do with the fact that all three of those people that you mentioned, will look great in a model rail replacement podcast t-shirt.
That's very true. That is very true. Right then, so that's really what we've been up to this week. We've done a lot, really, I suppose, which is kind of the same with the news, because I could say play the news music, but what is there to really talk about? I don't think there's anything really, is there?
No, not really. It's definitely felt like a much slower week, which sometimes you need those. It just so happens that usually the big news weeks also fall on the weeks where we have an hour and a half main segment as well. So it doesn't always fall when we need it to.
I
Um,
have noticed this. Yes, these discussion episodes, as we tend to cycle through, tend to be the shorter episodes, and the news also tends to be the shorter part. So obviously following the same cycle. I think they've already previously announced, but Revolution trains their WIA car carrier wagons are now available to be ordered through Rails, at least, and maybe other retailers. I'm not so certain. It's just I had an email from Rails to tell us that, but they were announced late last year. These are the blue ones, most commonly seen, I think. You see them come from the Morris Cowley mini plant in Oxford, and then they go to Southampton Docks. That's one of their main routes. Sometimes see them go north of Banbury, like in just one set of wagons. I think they may be part of MOD trains when they're used like that, because I'm not quite sure why they run like that. That's really it. Otherwise, I think. Yeah, no, nothing news, I suppose, but if there are any companies out there listening that do want us to announce anything that they have got out, do feel free to email us and let us know.
I have got news. I have got news.
No, it's too late. I've given the email out.
Breaking news. So after we were talking about payment plans and different shops and stuff like that, TMC reached out to me, the Model Centre, to let me know that they actually do payment plans as well, where you can pay in installments for your items. So they reached out just to clarify that they also do it. They don't do it on their website. I don't want to use the exact phrase that was used, but basically it's very much you have to phone up or send an email to the Model Centre and they can work something out for you. One of the gentlemen who works on the phones contacted me and said, actually, if you phone up the Model Centre and you'd like to do a payment plan for pre-orders or bits and bobs, you can give them a call and they'll be able to help you out as well. So it's not as sophisticated as with the Accurascale website where you can do it all there and then on the website. But if you are looking to use a different shop than one that actually offers a payment plan, there's one for you. So they reached out to me. I said I'd give them a quick shout out because I've always said that a payment plan is a good option where rather than you sort of having to save the money and accidentally spending it, being able to just put £20 in every sort of couple of months or every month is a good idea. So I wanted to give them a quick shout out for that as well.
Lovely. Well, that's cool. That's cool. So they weren't contacting you in regards to their model challenge that I nominated you for then?
No, not yet. Hopefully, my friend who's listening, I don't know if I'm allowed to say who it actually is, but hopefully if my friend's listening, they'll be able to then start putting my name forward for it as well. And I do need a goon/assistant so I can get James on board.
Yeah, we'll see about that. Right.
I don't think anyone is of the mind that you will be the assistant in this situation.
Unless it needs weathering.
All right. I'm a little bit better than that.
What good are you to me? Actually, you know electronics far better than I do. So.
But bear with me whilst I give you next week's episode to edit.
Do what? You're a producer. There's a reason I deliberately started saying that.
Give me some worth to what I'm doing. Anyway, James, what have we got coming up in the show?
There's some work there. I need to get out of it somehow. I know. Right. What are we doing this week? Oh, I know what we're doing. It's a discussion week. We're having a little chin wag, a little chat. And we thought, actually, you know what? We talk a lot about things around the hobby, but we haven't really been talking about the hobby. Nothing really model rail related. And everyone loved the Fiddle Yard episode, didn't they? So talking of weathering, we thought we'd talk of weathering. Shall we talk about weathering? Upset you now, haven't
I don't want to be a second grade goon.
Sir, a delivery has arrived for you.
Bring it through, Wilson. This'll be my loco I sent to Emperor's Path.
Was it airbrush or oils this time?
Both. It's all very affordable.
Even for a poorly paid butler like me?
Oh, yes. Just remember, Emperor's Path Weathering.
Contact Sam at Emperor's Path via email at emperorspathcontact@gmail.com or Instagram at emperors_path. If it's not filthy, let's fix that.
Look at that.
Right, here we are then. We are going to talk about weathering this week. A bit of a jump from building fiddle yards, I suppose. We probably should talk about layout building at some point. In fact, someone asked us about some layout planning, didn't they? How to get from your smaller layout to your bigger layout. So maybe that's something to discuss in the future. But no, this week, weathering. Sam, you like weathering, don't you?
I do like weathering. And I genuinely think it really brings your stock, your layout, everything to life. And I think it's one of those things where it's so subjective. You could easily sit here and say it has to be weathered or it doesn't have to be weathered, or the amount of people who tell me it's too much and all this sort of stuff. Not only do you have the the group of people who tell you that it must be expertly weathered, but then you've got the group of people who tell you that it's too heavily weathered or not weathered enough, or that you've got it's a minefield. And the best thing I can say is do what you like. If you want it to be heavily weathered, have it heavily weathered. If you want it to be realistic, make it realistic, but do it to what suits your needs is probably the best caveat that I can put out here right now. Is my layout set in the middle of winter? No, technically it's set in autumn, but you know what? One of my favorite videos that I take inspiration from, and I've talked about it over and over again, is a Portsmouth and Southsea video where everything's disgusting, and I love it, and I think it looks good, and I think having weathered stock does look better. But I also know plenty of people who don't think that. James, your rebuttal.
Yeah, there's a very curious amount of people out there that like their models pristine, which is fair enough. Like you say, we've brought this up before and discussed it before. I don't know, maybe on the podcast, but I know when we've had guests on, and I've told them a story where someone had bumped into me at the NEC show, and I'd mockingly said, "Oh, Sam's not as good at me as weathering," but the reason for that was that we are completely different type of weatherers, aren't we? I have a completely different artistic style to what yours is, and that doesn't mean that my weathering is better than yours. It doesn't mean your weathering is better than mine. It's all dependent on who wants that model to be weathered and how they want it. And that's why you do have people come to you that do want models weathered exactly the same way as you like to model them, in nice, dirty, grimy things. And whereas I will spend hours following a photograph and get about one model a year weathered, whereas you've got a production line going. It's
You've hit it on the head there, because that obviously this joke has been, and I don't think it's ever been properly mentioned on the podcast, but we've definitely talked about it in interviews, and I know we definitely spoke about it with George Williamson. In that you've hit it. You are, and I'll say this on the podcast for everyone to hear, you are, out of the two of us, you are the better weatherer in terms of like for like. You look at a picture, those VGA vans that you did that were from an MOD train last year, phenomenal. Yeah. The work that you put into weathering those was outstanding. But like you say, it took you 3 months, 6 months, 2 months. Yeah, it took you a long time to do them. And it is very much a case of, I am, as a weatherer, me personally, I'm a production line weatherer. My job is to get something in and get it back out to the customer. And 9 times out of 10, I'm weathering rolling stock or one single loco, and people give me inspiration pictures, and I try to follow them as much as I possibly can. But I'm not exact detail. I'm not going to get this picture. This might turn off people who might have been considering coming to me. Like, I'm not an exact weatherer when it comes to my style. My style is, you want it to look dirty and grubby and grimy, I can do that, and there's a million different ways that we can achieve that. Whether it's through oils or airbrush or however you want to do it. And I think going from that statement, it is so interesting as to how people then, if you're not in the weathering club and you think that everything has to be pristine, that's absolutely fine. You could listen to this and you might find out some interesting bits. You could skip this entire episode when you see that the title is weathering. Back in the early 2010s, a lot of the rolling stock that came out of the factories pre-weathered was very much a dusting with the airbrush, but of the weirdest possible colors. So I have some stock where it came with not a sleeper grime brown, but almost like a cork colored brown.
Yeah. Do you know what? I was looking at some milk wagons the other day by Daypole, and the one I wanted was a silver one, but they had weathered it. But the colour, it was like this almost oxide red, brown, iron ore, all over, and I was just it didn't look right. And I know when I think Hornby first ventured into bringing out weathered models, I think Bachmann are kind of the same. Like you say, the factory weathered models, I think, are some of the worst models. They've got better over the years, but those early days stuff was some of the worst weathering I'd ever seen. It quite clearly, someone had just got an airbrush, filled it up with one colour, and just ran it along the side of the model. Went, there you go, it's weathered now. And they looked, I want to swear, they looked dog poo.
Yeah,
literally with a colour.
But it's that weird thing of like, but then you'd have them charging an extra £10 to £20 per wagon loco based on whether it was weathered or not. And actually, in some situations, it's not worth that amount. You'd be better off to get something that's pristine and have it weathered to match the rest of your stock, if that makes sense. That's
Yeah.
easy for me to say. I have an airbrush and I've been weathering for years, but there's like really little things that you can do with weathering. And I think that some of the early stuff that came out, you might get a brake van that would sit with a China clay train that's been weathered in this dog poo brown. Let's refer to it as dog poo brown. But then all of the China clay wagons will have been weathered with just white, which, yeah, the top sides of it would be white and there'd be white residue, but you'd still get all of the stuff coming up from the rails. So there should be some sort of brown on there. And it's almost like a color theory side of it where when I talk to people, it shows a lot of my own personal stock is done with oil paints and then airbrushing to tie it all together. And it's that sort of thing. The oil paints you have to imagine are the gravity. They're start at the roof and work their way down. And then the airbrush side of it is meant to be what sprays up from the tracks or the certain grime and stuff like that. So the idea is that oil stuff goes from top to bottom, airbrush stuff goes from bottom to up. And you choose as a modeler how much you want to do on there. I always maintain that Seacow wagons or something along those lines are perfect ones to do, because looking at my rake now, not one of them is done exactly the same. Some of them I will have gone really dark on the recesses on them, but kept the panels really light. And then some of them I will have gone really heavy. Some of them I will have used a sponge to create sort of like a chipping, rusting effect on it. And some of them I will have gone light with the actual rusting and the oil weathering, but I'll have gone really heavy on the airbrush so that it appears darker and you almost can't see the paint. And it's such a subjective thing where you're trying to make something look more real, but sometimes you do get to use that artistic license of what you want. It doesn't always have to be picture perfect. And my example, and I've said this to you off camera before, the Network Southeast Class 33. I think it's a beautiful loco. It's one of Hellion's best models. As a loco, if you look for pictures of it, someone's going to come back to me with something that contradicts this, but bear with me. You look at a picture of it, bear in mind it's in a passenger livery. You look for pictures of it, there's not really any pictures of it pulling a passenger train or a passenger rake. It's 9 times out of 10, it's pulling something that's a bit more freight or engineer sort of train. Yet, ironically, to the contradiction of the fact that it's working with freight, I mean, you look at the old Southern GBRF 73, it's almost brown nowadays. But this, when you look for pictures of it, as a loco, it's immaculate. It's pulling freight and it's immaculate. But it's also not pulling the passenger stock that you'd expect it to. Now, me personally, whilst it's not realistic, I weathered mine a little bit heavier than normal because I think that's how it should look. I sort of, instead of looking at pictures of the 33 and how to weather it, I looked at the 50s and the 47s that were in Network Southeast and go, right, how can I weather this so that it looks realistic in terms of weathering, but it's not realistic to a photo of the 33? And I think that's one of the ways where you have to go, what do you want to make this work?
Yeah, it's again, it comes back to that artist style, doesn't it? Of how you. It's the same with building your layout and how you want to represent your world and how you want it to look. Everyone has different methods of doing things. Everyone can, people have different ideas of how to ballast track, how to weather the rails, how to model buildings. It's all. I mean, I think I saw it in a magazine article today. It's railway modelling art, and I think we've had this question before. We said it is a form of art, isn't it? It's creating a world, and you as the artist, that's your brushstroke, isn't it? That's how you are interpreting what you see and how you are expressing it in your own way. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a good example, though. You've seen 33s, you think, that's not how I want it to look. And so then you've taken a different loco and gone, well, it could look like this. And there's no reason why it couldn't look like that, because 9 times out of 10, your layout is probably a fictional world anyway. So why can't that loco be in a fictional world where it did get a bit dirtier, where the washing plant isn't working or they didn't have time to clean it? There's no reason why that couldn't happen.
Yeah. And I think the internet is, we've talked about how good the internet is for a supportive community and stuff like that. And we've also had it where people give you messages that aren't necessarily supportive or not worded in the right way. And one thing that always comes up is people say, oh, then they were never that heavily weathered, or they're always clean because they've been through the coach wash. And even in this day and age where at Fratton they have a coach wash, the amount of locos that would pull into Fratton train station, so they will have gone from Fratton and then they would have gone through the coach wash and then gone down to the harbour, or they will have got that. Either way, they should be clean. And they come into the station and they're minging. They're just absolutely disgusting. And not only are the sides dirty and they've got streaks running down them and they've got dirt and grime that's been kicked up from the rails, but also the units themselves, especially at the ends, are disgusting. All you have to do is stand at London Waterloo and see how disgusting some of the units that come up there are. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some cleaner units that are there, but you kind of, if you say it's too dirty, someone will come back with a picture of it being disgustingly filthy. If you say it's too clean, someone will come back with a picture of it being that clean. And the idea is that people use inspiration of what is around and what they can get photos of to sort of go off it. And I think for me, the easiest way I can word it, and it's why I always used to make the suggestion of, if you're getting a loco and a rake of things done, 9 times out of 10, if it's coaches, you can get the coaches done with an airbrush where you just go to the bogies and the underframe with the airbrush and keep the rest of it relatively clean, maybe a little bit across the roof or something like that. And it will make it look more realistic than an out of the box coach. Because the thing with the coaches is the underframes are so shiny and black that it's not realistic. But you also don't want to completely cover them with oil paints and an airbrush at certain times, because they are looked after and they are relatively clean. But the bogies and the underframes, they're almost dirty the second they leave any sort of coach wash or anything like that.
Yeah, it's got to run down the side, doesn't it? And usually runs onto the underframe. But the other thing to consider is someone could say, right, it never looked that dirty, or it never looked that clean. But take any locomotive that's been put on the Autumn treatment trains, that's been running around for 3 months with the water jet wagons spraying up all that dirt, and they are absolutely caked in mud, absolutely. And then one day they're on that duty, the next day that turn ends because the timetable changed. We don't need to run that anymore. And and I've seen him, some poor bloke out on the depot, the fuel point at Didcot with a brush, he's just cleaning the dirt off. And then the loco's clean. So one day it was filthy, the next day it's clean. It all depends on the date, doesn't it, as well, with your weathering?
Yeah, and there's so many options of it. So we've talked about how viable weathering is. So you and I have already said we are different types of weatherers. So if I was going to sit to you and say, right, okay, so you're going to weather a wagon. For our listeners at home, give me a rough idea. If you were going to sit a wagon down as a beginner, an intermediate, and an expert, what are the kind of things that you do to make it so that somebody who has not weathered before could come into the hobby and start doing it easily, versus someone who comes in as an expert and it's their 100th wagon and they're doing X, Y, and Z on it? How would you get them to do it?
Well, beginner-wise, I'd say what I did when I came back the very first time to the hobby was I used to use artist pastels to weather wagons with, and you seal them with a bit of hairspray or matte varnish. And that kind of worked okay. I wouldn't recommend it nowadays. I think there's better methods, but that's quite how I started. I would say if you were beginning, depending how much you wanted to splash out the cash, there's the Life Color weathering set. I think is an excellent set to start with. And it's got basics of a weathered black. There's sleeper grime, track dirt, brake dust, roof dirt, and one other I can't quite think of right now. But 6 very useful colours. And I used to, if you wanted to do a wagon with them, you just use the roof dirt and the weathered black for the body side. Then the sleeper grime on the frame, just a little bit up onto the body, and then I'd always use the track dirt on the wheels, and then just the brake dust doesn't really get much of a look in, but just a little bit of brake dust on there. And you can those sets are about £20 with a couple of brushes, and that's how you could probably get started with just a couple of paint brushes for wagons.
Mm.
If you want to go really basic, real basic starting, I think it's Humbrol. It's the brown leather color, which I can't think off the top of my head, and probably like a sort of darkish grey, almost black sort of color as well, and just use them as either washes or dry brushing. You could probably just get away with that just for weathering, I reckon.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. I was intrigued as because we are different types of weatherers. How would you attack that, or how would you recommend to someone to start it? I think the pastels is a great, especially for someone who's got young kids, because it means that they can get stuck in and get their hands dirty with it. So I think we use the same technique, and this is what I usually tell people at shows with the pastels. Obviously, usually when you buy a cheese grater, you get the cheese grater that everyone uses, and then you get the really fine one that no one uses unless they're Italian. That's the one you want. You want the really fine one, and you can effectively grate the pastels on your cheese grater and save the powder, and you are effectively creating weathering powders. Is that what you do, or do you do it a different way?
Yeah. I used to use a bit of sandpaper, so
Oh, okay.
just rub the pastel on the sandpaper. You get the dust, get a nice soft brush, and then just lightly apply it. You don't want to go too heavy and too thick with it, because uh, it's always about being subtle, isn't it? I think the word subtle, I mean, maybe not your case. With pastels, definitely pastels and weathering powders, subtle. Be as subtle as you can, because if you go in too heavy, it's obvious. It doesn't look right, and then when you start trying to seal it in with matte varnish or anything like that, you might find that it still starts to congeal and clog, and it doesn't look as good as what it once did. Which is probably the hardest part of getting pastels or weathering powder right, because you might weather it and go, that looks really good, and then you go to seal it, and then half the tones disappeared because the varnish is sort of taking that saturation out of it. But yeah, that's that. I mean, that's how I used to do it. Yeah, I think maybe just a bit of brown paint, a sort of a sleeper grimy sort of color paint. Like I say, the Humbrol leather brown, I think is the one that usually gets recommended. I think it's a Tim Shackleton. He does a couple of books on weathering, and he always recommends that color, and gunmetal as well as a weathering color.
Hmm.
Sort of those are his two main colors, if I recall.
Yeah.
Uses them for almost any project. So that's kind of where you probably want to start, and then you don't need loads of paints. You can venture and try different brands or different colors, but I think you are probably the same. Once you find the colors that work for you, you tend to stick to the same colors. You don't
Yeah.
really
There's certain colors. So I've got a paint rack that sits in front of my desk, and there's three colors that get used all the time, and then there's 7, 8, 9 colors that have sat there, and I've used them maybe once or twice. Use them sort of like the really finite bits or a particular request or something like that. But yeah, you find your groove of what works for you and how you want to use it.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, I think if you want to start in weathering, it's curious. There's plenty of videos on YouTube, but no one watches them, as we found out, because we've both done weathering videos, and
Yep.
no one watches them. I don't know why, because everyone asks the questions, don't they? They always, can you do a video on weathering? And I'd like to see some weathering, and I'll do, and then you do them, and no one watches them, and I don't know why that is. I don't know. Are people afraid of having a go at it, or is it just that it's just not relevant to them? They're not interested in it. Is there too many videos on weathering? Is it once you've seen one, you've seen them all? Um, it's a very curious sort of thing, because I think weathering is one of my favorite parts of the hobby. I think it really brings anything to life. Is once that's subtle, because that's how that's how Star Wars looked so real when it came out in the 70s, because before that, all the sci-fi movies, they'd go and build their rocket ship models for the film, and then they'd be pristine and clean, and to the viewer they looked like a toy. You could tell that it was a model. And then Star Wars come along, and George Lucas went, look, I want a universe that looks used, that looks aged, everything's a bit worn out, kind of thing. So the X-wings have blaster marks on them. The Falcon's got streaks of dirt all over it. Nothing nothing looks brand new. It all looks used. It all looks dirty. And people went and watched that film and they believed, that these ships were real, that these models were actually flying over the space station, because they were weathered. They looked right. And I think that's the same principle which comes over to railway modeling. I think weathering is one of the best skills you can learn to make your layout look as realistic as possible.
Yeah, like big time. And I think there are always that the contrasts of, you can tell there's some people who weathering is life. Like if it's not weathered, it's not finished. And then you also get people who they might weather the layout, but they're too scared to weather the locos, or vice versa. You might get someone who has weathered stock because they get someone else to do it, but because they don't weather themselves, they can't then weather their layout. I mean, trying to get an airbrush up to your loft if you don't airbrush where your layout is, it's quite difficult. I'm very lucky. My airbrush sits in the exact same room, so I just take it out and plug it in somewhere else. But you can see it where, and I always find it when I get something new. So that 159 we talked about a couple of weeks ago is a perfect example. It's pristine at the moment, and I just haven't had the time to sit and weather it. But it's so obvious when you have a pristine loco that runs on an already weathered layout, or you have a really dirty, grubby loco that's on an immaculate layout that looks like it's in an IKEA showroom kind of thing. And it's about trying to find ways of weathering those bits that are still within your comfort zone. And that's why you get people like Joseph from that model railway guy. He weathers his track by painting it. So you paint the side of the rails, whereas I'm, some would say lazy, some using different methods. However you want to look at it, I airbrush it. I can't think of anything more mind numbing than having to paint the sides of my rails. That's not saying it doesn't work and it's not good. It's just that how I work, like we said, I'm on a factory line. I need to get this done, and I don't want to sit and weather effectively 6 feet's worth of track by hand with a paintbrush when stupid me has already put trees and fences down, and I've got a really fragile bridge that I don't want to have to lean on to do the painting.
Yeah, that's it. You watch the guys from Hobby Magazine whenever they do a layout build, it's always a couple of cans of I think the drab olive brown Humbrol come out, and Mike's just sprayed the entire track bed that he's just put down within 2 minutes of this aerosol. And like you say, it works perfectly fine. It's weathered, and it's better than the shiny rail side that was there before. Going in and painting it with a paintbrush like Joseph, probably you could pick it out in a different color to what you weather the sleepers, as they would weather in real life. And that's again, it's down to your own preference and personal choice, isn't it? It's going to take a lot longer, but it's probably going to look better than the all over in one color. But both of them, I think, look better than if you didn't do anything. So it all comes down to, I suppose, what you're confident in as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Where can you get to on the layout? Just a small tip that I hope works well for people, and you can take this away. And I don't weather like this now, but I know that when I used to weather Warhammer, I used the same technique and it worked really, really well. And if you're looking for a cheap way to get into weathering to test whether it's something that you want to do, 9 times out of 10, most of the weathering that you're going to want to do is in recesses, door hinges, and stuff like that. Find a brown. Find a brown that you really like the look of. It can be a light brown, it can be a dark brown, it can be a middle brown. My 2 browns that I use are Rail Match Sleeper Grime and Chocolate Matte by Humbrol. The Humbrol one I use because it goes in the airbrush. It's in a ready airbrush bottle, and it's the only reason I don't use just Sleeper Grime. Find your brown and find an orange. And if you can find a brown and an orange that you really like, it doesn't matter what brands you're using, there's different ones out there. But if you want to just give it a go, find an acrylic brown, acrylic orange, so that you just need water, you just need a paintbrush, get a good paintbrush that's got a nice point on it, and a bit of water, and something as simple as getting a milk lid. A milk bottle lid is perfect. Obviously, wash it first. These are really good individual little pallets that you can use that are not expensive, and you can recycle them, throw them out, whatever you want to do with them when you're done. And with the acrylic paint, just put a little bit in your, I'm using quotation marks, palette, and thin it down with the water. you will eventually work out what your consistencies are, and only by doing it will you understand. But with that acrylic paint, you could do something as simple as going on the hinges or the recesses of something. So let's say you've got a sea cow hopper where it's got loads of really deep recesses. What you can do is just use the brush, and you can either paint the line in the recess, or if you've watered it down enough, you could sit it at the top, put it in, and let gravity do the work, and you'll see the paint sink down. Now, because you've watered the paint down, it's not going to be as aggressive as you may think, and it can give you that sort of pop of color of the paint. Let it dry. Once you've got that, then do the same with an orange paint, and you can effectively do the same thing, make it slightly thinner. And what you can do is just do a little bit less than what you did previously, and you can do that in your recesses. Now, I used to use this on tanks to make them look battle worn and damaged and stuff like that. And this is before I discovered oil paints. But this is a really interesting way and a really cheap and effective way, because I think you could do all of this for under a tenner, depending on what brand you're buying. But it's a cheap and effective way you can practice on this. And then you can start using that to, let's say you get an oil tanker. You can do the same thing, but instead of looking at the recesses, you might use that dark brown or even a black to create the streaking of the oil dripping down the side of the tanker. And because it's curved, it's got that really nice, it could go so many different places. Give that a go and see if that's something that you enjoy. And if you like how it looks, you can then try different colors. You can try thinner paints, thicker paints, however you want to do it. But the joy of acrylics is that if you add more water to it, you can effectively water it down quickly and then use a cotton bud to quickly scrape it out. So if you make any mistakes or something you're not happy with, as long as you're quick enough to add more water to it to thin it down, you can get rid of anything that you think doesn't actually look okay. And it, like I say, that's not what I do nowadays, but that is certainly a good way of starting out with weathering if you're looking to try. And obviously something, the more disgusting, vile, hopper type thing that you want to work on, the better, because you can be a little bit more free with it. If you want to work on sort of hinges on coaches, you can do the same thing, but you just obviously have to be a bit more careful that it stays within that hinge and doesn't go all over the side of the coach. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to get into it, like we said, there's plenty of YouTube videos out there. There's some great books. Let's say Tim Shackleton's probably one of the best weatherers out there, and he's got a few books that you can use as guides. If someone was to go out today, go to a model shop and pick up a few bits to start weathering the very first go, what would you tell them to buy?
An acrylic brown paint. That's the best thing I can tell them to buy. If you were picking up one thing, acrylic brown paint, because that will do 90% of the work for you.
Brushes?
I mean, it's if I had to pick one thing, then it's the brown paint. But I mean, if you had £10 to spend, the best place you could go, if you've got a Warhammer shop near you, they have some of the best color palettes that you can pick from. I would go out and I would buy a Mournfang brown acrylic paint. I would buy a Riser Rust acrylic paint, and I would buy a brush that is, it's not a fine detail brush, but it's still a good enough brush that's got a tip on it. And that's all you need to start. And it's all about sort of improving from there. If you had all the money in the world, I'd say get an airbrush, because that's how I weather 90% of my stock has airbrush on it. But if you were going and you were just beginning, you could go out and buy those three things, and you would certainly be able to start and make a big dent in your journey from there. What about you?
I'd say exactly the same. It's a nice brown and a nice sort of blacky grey, probably the best two colours to start with, and a good decent brush to go with it. Probably consider the dry brushing method of dipping the brush in the paint and wiping it off till it's almost clean, and weathering that way is probably the best way to start if you're doing it with brushes. And start from there really, and get it's always recommended to start with a couple of cheap wagons until you're more confident and used to what you're doing. If you went with airbrush, then what would you go with? Because I have I upgraded my airbrush to an Iwata. I'm not sure which type one it was, but it was definitely worth the investment. But I've just got a little tiny Spraycraft compressor. You can only run it for around 20 minutes, but the way I weather it, that suits me just fine, and it's very quiet because I bought it so I could use it in the house when I've had it that long. I bought it before I'd sorted out the model room, and that's sort of how I started with airbrushing. But what would you recommend airbrush wise? If like you say, if people have the money to do it, what would you say to go for?
It sounds like a simple question. I'll try and answer it as best I can, as simplified as I can. It all depends on budget. So if you are weathering track, one of the easiest ways you could do it, and probably one of the more forgiving ways for having to carry it around, you can buy cake decorating airbrushes off eBay for about £30 that are USB rechargeable. Do they have the control that you'd get with a higher end airbrush? No, but it certainly is something you could use to start weathering your track. So if you wanted to give weathering a go, have a portable version. You can find, I bought one years ago and did my old layout with it. They are really good. They're about £30. Would I recommend it for weathering stock, wagons and stuff? Yes. I don't know if you could get away with the finite precision you might need on a coach, but my general go-to is, and I'm going to use Amazon as a reference, for about £107, you can usually buy a compressor, a gun, and all the bits you need to get started, minus the paints. And it will give you a decent compressor that doesn't burn out within a certain period of time. I'm talking as someone who sometimes I spend 8 hours a day at shows weathering nonstop. So I need a compressor that can handle it. So you're looking for one that ideally has 2 tanks. So you'll see sort of like a silver tank with a black tank underneath, and that just basically stores more air for you. So it means that your pressure is constantly kept up. Now, me usually, and James, you might be aghast when I say this, I usually run somewhere in the region of about 60 psi when I'm airbrushing. If you don't have a dial to change what sort of pressure you're running, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I run a high pressure because I know that my airbrush needs to go through a lot of stuff over the course of a couple of hours. So you can buy a kit that has an airbrush gun and an airbrush that pretty much will do all of the stuff that you need it to do when you first begin. The compressor is the kind of thing that you want to buy, and that's going to be most of the cost, because you'll find that you could buy a compressor without the gun for only a couple of quid less. Then that's when you look at upgrading your gun once you've gotten used to it. So I'm going to assume, James, you have the Neo Iwata as
That sounds about right. Yeah, actually, yeah.
Was it about £100?
I think we got it off Amazon in a deal
Yep.
for 80, actually.
That sounds about right. Cool. So that is, or would be, that would be my go-to airbrush. If you were going to upgrade from your normal airbrush, go for that. Especially if all you're doing is weathering. You have to remember, I do a lot of repaints. So I could sit here and tell you that the airbrush I use is super precision, super fine, and I can do all this stuff with it. But that's because I'm doing fine lining, and I have to make sure that the consistency of the paint is perfect because I'm doing colors after colors after colors. When you're airbrushing for weathering, you don't need that. So the Neo Iwata is a fantastic airbrush, and I can't see, if you're just using it for weathering, why you'd need to upgrade any further. It was my go-to airbrush for painting as well, and it's the same airbrush I used when I was doing Warhammer. It did so much of the work for me. It would still do all the bits I needed to do. However, and this is what you should always enter Instagram competitions, guys. I won a few years ago a Harder Steinbeck Infinity CR Plus in an Instagram competition, which when it first came out was a £350 airbrush. And it is fantastic. It is a workhorse. It does allow me to sit and weather all day at a show. And all I do at the end of the day is I then put a cleaning solution in it, leave it, come back to it the next day, and it does it again. As long as you're looking after your compressor and stuff, you're okay. So you can buy these £107 kits off Amazon, and they will suit you for what you're using it for from a weathering point of view. I know I said I was going to simplify it. I've tried to simplify it as much as I possibly could. There's so many little...
Give us some good ideas there, doesn't he?
Okay.
What to think about. You mentioned cleaning. What? Because I find cleaning the airbrush is probably the most tedious part of owning an airbrush, and sometimes can put me off. I might decide that I want to airbrush something today, and then I just think, oh, I can't be bothered to clean the gun afterwards, and so I'll just go do something else. And how do you go about cleaning your brush? Have you got any tricks or methods that allow you to clean it? Because obviously you have to keep it immaculate for it to work. Do you have sort of a ritual what you follow or anything like that?
So, if I could recommend anything to anyone, um, get yourself some isopropyl alcohol or IPA, and you want the strong 99% stuff. Then get yourself, they call them tattooist bottles, and it's basically a plastic bottle that's got a sort of a spout on it, but it curves at almost a 45, 90-degree angle. And the idea is
Hmm.
tattooists use them where once they've done loads of work, they'll put the cleaning solution over your arm and wipe it off with this stuff, and it keeps it moist so that you don't and your arm doesn't dry out of all the blood and ink and stuff. If you've never got a tattoo, that won't make any sense. Um, but you basically want, you could go out and buy really expensive cleaning solutions. They're garbage in comparison to what you're about to spend your money on. So this is cheaper than buying a cleaning solution. And I've tried various cleaning solutions and they're okay, but they're not as good as this. So what you want is in that bottle, you want a 10% isopropyl alcohol in there and the rest water. And then when you finish a color or you finish your airbrushing, what you want to do is you want to put this solution into your cup. Ideally, you've emptied out all your paint anyway. Put this solution in there, run it through the airbrush. Once your airbrush isn't running the paint through and it's this sort of cleaning solution, leave it for a couple of minutes. I've been known to leave it for 2 minutes, and then other times I've left it for a couple of hours. What the isopropyl alcohol mixed with water does is once you've pushed it so that it's coming through the nozzle, it means that it's in the chamber, the bit you can't get to unless you want to take your airbrush apart. It then starts to break down, and this is an acrylic paint way of doing it. I can't speak for enamel because I hate using enamel and I don't use it personally.
Bad for your lungs.
Yeah, bad for your lungs. And I've tried using it once, and I only have one color on my shelf that is enamel, and that's because 9 times out of 10 it's the one that a customer will recommend, and that is the enamel Rail Match Network Southeast Blue, and it's because it is the only ready to run Network Southeast Blue I could get at the time, and all of the Network Southeast Blues are all in enamel form. So since then, I have created my own Network Southeast Blue using 2 different scale 75 paints. That's not here or there for the moment, but if anyone wants to buy my paint, I've got a recipe. But you have to sign up to Patreon for that. Yeah, so the isopropyl alcohol and the water will sit in that chamber, and what it will do is it will work away at the paint. What you then want to do, and James, I'm going to ask from your point of view of an airbrush, because mine has a very weird nozzle on it. Does yours have a flat nozzle on the end where you could put your finger over the front of it?
Yeah, I think so. I haven't seen it in a while. It's been packed away. So.
What
Off
you
the top
need
of
to
my head.
effectively what you need to effectively do is you want to try and pinch or close off the end of your airbrush. So with me, I have what looks like a little trident, like a two-pronged type fork, a little bit like a tuning fork from music. And you want to put your finger over the end of the airbrush, hold it, pinch it. You basically want to stop any air coming out. And then you slowly pull your trigger back on the airbrush. And what will happen is you'll create this like little jacuzzi in your cup. And this is why you do it slowly, because otherwise it will spray out everywhere over you. But you do that slowly. And what it will do is all of that isopropyl alcohol you left in the chamber will have worked away at all that paint. And then it will come and it will sort of back up into like a little jacuzzi in your pot. That will have broken down the paint that is stuck inside that you can't get to without taking your entire airbrush apart, pushed it into your cup, tip it away, and you can rinse and repeat. One of the biggest comments I get at shows is, "Oh, how do you clean your airbrush? How do you stop it from clogging?" And the only way you can really do it is get an old toothbrush. Well, no, not an old toothbrush. Buy a cheap toothbrush, and you can just quickly clean the end of the needle or pinch it with your fingers. It is as simple as just pinching off the paint to without you having to fully take the airbrush apart. But that isopropyl alcohol technique, it's all I use. I don't have any cleaners anymore. I bought them years ago, and I think I've got one almost full one sat under my desk that's never actually been used. And it will do you a lot better at running your airbrush. And then you rinse and repeat, make sure that you're making sure that your airbrush is pushing out a little bit of that liquid, stop, start again, repeat. If you find that you're still struggling, then It is simple as taking the needle out quickly, giving the needle a quick brush, and then putting it back in. One of the smallest tips that I've been told, but you know what? It's worked for me for years. Years ago, I was told by a gun cleaner and stuff like that, don't do that. Most of the stuff that you use for gun cleaner to lubricate guns is in some way cancerous. Don't do it. It was a terrible idea, and I found out after the fact about it, and I regret that decision. If you're struggling with your needle and you find that stuff's not, if it's clogging on the end of it, dip your needle just a little bit into a little bit of olive oil, and that will naturally lubricate your needle on your airbrush, and it will stop paint sticking to it. Not 100%, but it lubricates the needle, because the idea is that you don't want your paint to stick to your needle. You want your paint to use the needle as sort of, you have to imagine that it is effectively like the plug on your bath. This is how an airbrush works. Your paint is all the bath water that you have sitting in your bath, and it wants to come out of the front and it wants to go down the drain. When you pull the trigger back on your airbrush starts off at a point so that effectively it starts with the thickest part. As you pull the needle back, you create a bigger gap between it is your plug hole. It is the equivalent of lifting your plug up a little bit or pulling the entire plug out to let all of the water through. If you pull your airbrush back fully, you are letting so much paint through, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. It's why when you sit with your airbrush, try practicing on a little bit of paper, try writing your name. You effectively need to learn clutch control. Those of you who don't drive, I'm really sorry. This is the best analogy I have for it. Every airbrush is different. It is like driving a new car. It is like learning a new clutch on a new car. They are completely different. If I go out in my work van and then I drive our family car, I'm screaming the family car down the road because I'm so used to having to give a lot of gas and quick clutch release versus our petrol family car, which is like vroom, and it goes off like a Mario Kart down the road. You have to learn your clutch control on it. You see people who pull the trigger back on an airbrush and just go to town and try and spray as much as possible in quick succession. That is how you make mistakes. That is how you clog your airbrush. That is how you create problems for you further down the road. Feather your airbrush. That's where, instead of going and sorry, I don't know what that's going to sound like audio wise, and it's probably me who's going to have to fix it in post. So apologies. But you effectively, what you see a lot of people do is they pull the trigger down and they pull it back as far as possible. So they're spraying the maximum amount of air through and they're pulling the trigger back to allow the maximum amount of paint through. That doesn't create realistic weathering. That creates the image of a toddler with poster paint spraying paint all over your expensive coaches and locos. What you want to do is you want to effectively constantly up and down on the trigger to allow air, no air, air, no air, and slowly pulling back. And this is where practicing on a piece of paper will give you that control that you need. And I always tell people, write your name. And I think Charlie Chadwick Model Railway did the same thing. And I saw him do it. I was like, it's good to see that someone's teaching people to do this, because it's a very important part. You will only learn how to use an airbrush if you use the airbrush. You have to practice with it. It is like a musical instrument. If you pick up an airbrush and you're good at it straight away, fantastic. That's really good for you. But most people, you have to sit and practice and get used to how you're doing it. In the model railway world, we are not always fully repainting everything like you would if you're doing Warhammer and stuff like that. We are only 9 times out of 10 weathering. So you have so much more leeway than if you were painting a Warhammer army. And I use that because that's what I came from. I came from painting whole armies of Warhammer, where you go from grey plastic to whatever scheme you pick. So for me to then go to weathering, it's quite easy. It's quite relaxing. It's therapeutic, because I'm like, this is much easier than having to paint an entire color scheme on something. And it's why I started doing repaints on things so early on when I got into trains.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, there's some great tips there. My first introduction to actually using airbrush was I used a proper big paint gun with emulsion paint, because it's what we did decorating sometimes. And one of the tips that I can give people there is you never start painting by pointing your gun at the model. You paint it away from the model, and then you bring the brush along like you are doing a big brush stroke to the model, so it's nice and even. So you haven't got like a big splat in the middle where you've just pulled the trigger and the paint's hit it, and then you've moved your arm across, because that's one of the worst things you can do. So yeah, it's that's where I learned to airbrush was in a church painting walls. But yeah, I think there's some great tips there.
But I bet you learnt the control of the gun though,
Yes.
and I think that's the you didn't just pick it up and you didn't just pull the trigger and go, oh, I know what I'm doing. You had to learn. Oh, actually, this is how it sprays and this is what it does, right?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, yeah. I got shown how to use it, and then given the gun, and then the method of how to paint it on, and that was it. Really, you then practice there, and you learn how to apply it properly. And like you say, you didn't just pick it up and just start firing at the wall because just make a mess, and you get big splats of paint everywhere that would be almost impossible to try and even out. And sort of blend in. It would be obvious that the paint was thicker there than it was to the side of it.
And I guess that comes down to when you're painting a room as well. You don't overload the brush. I think you said that to me when we joked about the fact that I was brush painting an entire room, and you were saying about like you don't overload the brush, and it's very much the same thing. And the paint thickness is always something that comes up, even if something says airbrush ready. Go with the benefit of the doubt that it's not. Because you probably want to add, thinners. We haven't even talked about thinners, and that is a very crucial part. There's this weird misconception, and I know channels have said it, and it's one of the things that it kind of bugs me. Not enough for me to go on a rant about it there, but enough that I feel like I need to say to people: if someone tells you that you have to use a thinner that matches your brand of paint, that is codswallop. That is absolute codswallop. The only thing that matters when it comes to thinners is, are you using it for the right type of paint? Are you using an acrylic thinner with an enamel paint? That is wrong. Are you using an acrylic thinner with an acrylic paint? Perfect. It does not matter what brand of thinner you are using with which paint. This is such a big frustration to me because it makes people believe that they need to go out and buy 70 different types of thinners because they use Scale 75 for one color, Tamiya for another, Citadel for what. That's absolute codswallop. Don't do it. Don't waste your money or your time. Just get yourself an acrylic thinner that you like. Vallejo is a fantastic one to use. It is a very much all-round brand. The amount of times I've gone to shows and forgotten my thinners, I tend to buy a new one at a show, most shows. And I'm happy to go and pick up a thinner that is an acrylic thinner, and it works fine. There's nothing wrong with it. So if someone tries to tell you that you have to buy one that matches your brand, just nod and say thank you very much. Ignore them. Just buy one thing of thinners. Please don't go out and buy thousands of different types of thinners. It's pointless.
So yeah, and with acrylic stuff, I mean, some people say you can use water, but
Yes.
I say I'd assume that you'll be the same as me. That the thinner is the better option than the water. I find, in particular, life color. If you try and thin it with water and put it in the airbrush, it will clog the airbrush every time. I don't know what it is with that paint, but trying to use water as a thinner for that is not a good idea. But apart from that one, you can just use water, can't you?
Yeah, you can absolutely use water. It very much affects how the paint reacts. So there's nothing wrong with using water, and especially if it's your first go, use some water. That's absolutely fine. I hope this analogy comes across as best I can, and it's what I usually say to people at shows. Thinners thin the paint. Water waters it down. And I know that sounds really silly saying it out loud, but it's the trying to explain to people the difference between a thinner and watering something down. If you water down a paint with water, it does make it so that the pigments, it's almost like thinners make sure the pigment stays in one piece. And it would be the equivalent. I'm honestly trying to think of, if you tried to water down a cake mix with water versus using milk, you'd get a very different cake.
Yeah, it's the chemical composition in the thinner, isn't it, that's going to break the paint down to allow it to become, like you say, the pigment more spread out. Whereas I think adding the water to it, damn, the word just escaped my head. It was a good word. It was going to make me sound clever. But the pigment particles are basically suspended by the water and spread out rather than actually diluted to the thinner color. I think that's sort of how the chemical reaction works. And I imagine I live in quite a hard water area. I imagine the type of water that you use would probably have an effect on it as well.
Uh, yeah, it does. So I am also in a hard water area. In the long run, if you don't clean your brush, if you don't clean your airbrush properly, or you don't look after your stuff, you you will start to see a difference. If you start using isopropyl alcohol, it will stop limescale buildup or anything like that, and that can really affect what it's like. I made a an April Fool's video a few years ago where I advertised Emperor's Path sparkling water, airbrush sparkling water. Um, and but do you know what? As a joke, well, actually not as a joke, I did actually use sparkling water once in my airbrush because I looked around and where I was up in the loft, I was like, oh, I'm gonna have to go down and get a paint. Or I've got a bottle of sparkling water here. I'm just going to quickly add a little bit of sparkling water. It works. Like filtered water does work better in your airbrush than using straight up tap water. But if you've put isopropyl alcohol with it for your cleaner anyway, it's going to destroy most of the limescale type stuff, all the hard water that's in there anyway. It completely destroys any pH balance that water has.
I just like that you found a decent use for sparkling water for once because it's disgusting.
What? Oh, I love sparkling water. It's
Yeah. Why,
it,
why do I want carbon in my...
it helped me get over
You
it.
like some gas in your water, sir? No, not really. No, that tastes awful. It's actually not tasty now. It's not very nice. It just why?
Danny will know because every show that I rock up to, I always bring a 4 pack of sparkling waters. And I usually give one giant bottle to Danny, and then I consume the other 3 over the weekend. I, I just like sparkling water. I think it's nice. It helped me curb a horrendous Coke, and let me rephrase that. It helped me. It helped me curb a really bad Coca-Cola and Pepsi addiction that I had from working at Pizza Hut years ago, where you used to get it on tap. And it was literally, you didn't have, it was a case of if you wanted some Pepsi, you could have Pepsi there and then. And then I found out when I left Pizza Hut and moved to work at an army barracks, I was like, oh, I'm getting like weird shakes. Oh, it's because I haven't drunk the equivalent of 14 liters of Pepsi over the course of today. And then I was like, I need something. Sparkling water helped curb that. But that has nothing to do with weathering, James. So if you were going to tell somebody like some of your things to look out for with weathering that you think are a really nice touch that you could work with, what would you do? Because I have something that I think is, and I was a bit late to this game, but I think it's something you can certainly start using towards weathering to add a little bit of extra depth. But is there something that you think, we haven't mentioned it already, that you'd recommend for people who were weathering?
Sounds like you're just trying to sort of trick me into giving an answer here, and I don't know. But I mean, um, I always, I'd always say, don't be afraid to mix your mediums. You don't be afraid to use paint and a bit of weathering powder. Um, there's no wrong in doing that. Model, take your model, weather it with the paints, and then get a little bit of sort of sooty coloured weathering powder, put it underneath the smoke box, and sort of pile it up and seal it in with some varnish to make it look like it's sat there from when the loco's had its pipes cleaned. Things like that, and you just those little subtle details. Little white limescale streaks down the side of the tank where the water spilled over. It just all adds to the effect. I think it's probably what I'd put forward there.
Mm.
There's other stuff. I've had to go with weathering pencils. They can sometimes be okay. I think I've used pens before for weathering.
Mm-hmm.
Picked out details with that. Sometimes you just look around what you got. It's not so much weathering, but I mean, when it comes to figure painting, for eyes, I get a mechanical pencil and just shade in the eye with a mechanical pencil, rather than people paint white and then put a pupil in there and it kind of look like a Simpsons character. I used to do eyes like that, and until you look at them and go, they look awful, especially because you can never get the eyes quite right, and they're sort of one's looking at you, the other one's looking at the candy machine kind of thing. So that's why I changed my method, and yeah, I would use a graphite pencil for that, and you could probably use graphite pencils for weathering as well for certain things. So I suppose I'd say don't be afraid to experiment and use different mediums and sort of combine stuff, I suppose.
I love the idea of adding the weathering powders to the paint. I'd never thought of that, but it would add such a lovely texture to the paint that you're putting on.
Oh
Um,
yeah, definitely. Yeah. If I used to do it with tenders, you know, get a really nice rusty color for the tender and mix in some brownie rust weathering powder, and the texture it comes up with, it just looks fabulous. It's yeah.
I was going to say sponge weathering is also a really,
Oh yes.
really handy tool to use. And this, once again, it comes down to freight and not using it on necessarily your passenger stock and things like that. But whether you're using oil paints, acrylic paints, enamel paints, you can buy. The range is a fantastic place to just go pick up stock and things that you think you might need to weather. If you want to go out and you want literally just small little things, they sell. It's like a giant football sponge. James and I are roughly the same age, but do you remember the sponge footballs that people used to
Yeah.
play with? They were the only footballs allowed on the playground when I was little.
The lever might come off and take someone's eye out. What?
Ours was smashing the surrounding neighbours' windows, I think was the excuse they gave. But yeah, you'd halfway through a term, you'd end up with a ball that's not really a sphere anymore. The foam had like come off from people booting it and all this sort of stuff. But you can effectively buy a like a mini football size sponge. And the good thing about sponge weathering is you can rip off a piece of sponge and it can be something that is the same sort of size as the tip of your finger. You can have a giant piece, you can have really tiny pieces. And the method is you work to what suits you, whether you use it with tweezers, whether you use your hands, or you do all these like little bits and bobs. But using a bit of sponge and dipping it in some paint, practice on a little bit of kitchen towel to see how much paint's actually on there. And this is one of those methods where you use it as sort of a slow process. You start slow and eventually it will layer itself up. And you use the sponge to create texture, especially on like hinges. And I'm using sea cows and sea lions because A, they're right in front of me, but also they are, because of how they're built, where there are effectively lots of panels with a ridge section going along it. You've got so many areas where you can add this texture to. And you can use your sponge and you just sort of sponge weather. And you know that especially on corners or the edge of something is where they're going to get knocked by bits. And they're carrying ballast all the time. So they're constantly getting knocked, damaged and dinged. So you can use the sponge with a little bit of paint on it using your color of choice. And you can just sort of start off and you stipple it on. And let's say, for example, you know that at the bottom is going to be the heaviest. So if you start there and then the next time you do the bottom again, but you add in a little bit higher and a little bit higher and a little bit higher. And that's how you create depth with your weathering, which is often missed. Is if you're going to work on an area, you want to think, where's it mostly going to be accumulating? And you want to attack that first. And then you sort of slowly branch out and add a little bit more on there so that by the time you do your last layer, you might have the smallest speck of paint on one piece, but the area you started on and you wanted to focus as your most dinged and rusty part, you can see that you've built up this beautiful layer of texture there to the point where you can still see that it's speckles, but it's so close that if you did maybe one or two more layers, it almost looks like it's painted on. But by doing it with the sponge, you're creating a texture which you don't always see, but when it goes around your layout, and I say this to people with a lot of things with weathering, once you start adding texture and streaking, you might not always see it, but you might have a loco go past you and your coach, your wagon will suddenly catch a piece of light and you'll suddenly see something that you'd forgotten about. But because the light has picked it up, you go, oh, that looks nice. And then it's off and it's gone again. And it doesn't always have to be a centerpiece stage show piece of weathering, but it's enough that you've added something to something that when it goes past, it suddenly catches the light. You go, oh, and then it's gone again.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think sponge weathering is actually a really good shout. It's what I use a lot for painting buildings, particularly stonework. I'll get various shades of color and use the sponge and blend the colors together, and I think you get a really good effect by using the sponge for painting stonework. And like you say, I've used it. I've painted sea cows before, and again, use that sponge method for the rust patches on the model. The other thing you can do for the rust patches and model is there's either the hairspray technique or you can actually buy acrylic fluids that are designed for this. So for a peel effect, I've got an AK Solutions one that I use, but essentially you'll paint the model. So if you're weathering wood, for example, in a building, you paint the old wood color first, and then you'd apply this solution. Or if you're using hairspray, you can just spray a couple of layers on. I think the cheaper the hairspray, the better it works. So some real cheap pound shop hairspray on there, a couple of layers of that, let each layer dry off, then put your top coat on, then wet the top coat once it's dry, and then you can chip away at it with a toothbrush or toothpick or something like that, and that will give you a nice weathered effect for chip paintwork as well, which is sort of another method, kind of like what you can get with the sponge method. So yeah, again, it's looking around and seeing what's out there, because there are different ways of doing things that can suit you. When you might try something that doesn't quite work for you, it's all about experimenting, really, isn't it?
Yeah, big time. And I think we've talked about loads of different effects, techniques, and stuff like that. And I want to quickly circle back to you said about how you and I have both made weathering videos, and how people asked you to do a weathering video, and they're some of the worst performing ones. And usually I wouldn't, and I think we're in the same boat with this. Usually I wouldn't care so much about that. But with weathering tutorials or weathering videos, the amount of time you put into them versus your normal videos is 4, 5, 10 times more investment into doing it than you do on any other video. So when they don't perform, that's why we don't go back to them. We don't readdress them. I've had it before where people have asked me and asked me and asked me to do it, and then it's a terribly performing video. And whilst I don't necessarily do it for each video to be number one hit in the top 20, top of the pops kind of thing, it does hit hard when you spend a lot of time on a particular video that people have asked for and it doesn't perform. And you go, well, what's the point? I can make a 15-minute video where it only takes me 15 minutes to edit it, and it does X, Y, and Z. Or I spend hours weathering something, filming it, editing it so that it's condensed so that people can watch it, and then it doesn't get watched. It's a lot of time for how much you do. So if you are interested in weathering, before you ask, go and see if James and I have done weathering videos on it, or see if your usual YouTube people that you watch have done a video on it, because that's the really important part. Is we probably have done a video on it, but because people don't watch it, we're not going to do any more unless the other ones start doing suddenly really, really well. I did an entire painting series on how to use an airbrush, how to weather, how to effectively, if you wanted to paint something, whether it was a coach or a tank or something like that, I did a whole series on it. But it performed so poorly that I was like, well, I'm not going to do any more of that, because I tried my hardest to give all of these techniques and it just doesn't get watched. So
yeah, I totally agree. That's kind of what I've mentioned in the I've done the first 009 video, and I showed the old Hornby church that I got that painted up.
Yeah,
and I think it still sits on 348 views of showing people how to weather and paint a building. And like you say, all that time in it, it doesn't feel worth it sometimes. So yeah, if you are going out there and you are watching these videos and you do like them, you do like what people do, share them, because the YouTube has that ability. You can click on the share thing and you can send it to your friends and they can see it too. Post it on Facebook or Instagram that you've seen it, and let people know about those videos, because a lot of time and effort goes into them. And it's not just mine and Sam's, it's other people out there that do weathering videos. They need a lot more love and appreciation, I think.
That's the best thing I think we could say at the end of this is, if you do watch people's weathering videos, and share them, because that's the only way people will start doing more weathering videos, because people will complain there's not enough weathering videos out there. It's like, well, people don't watch them enough, so it's not really worth the time and money.
They're just buried in the algorithm of YouTube. You have to go find them. But
there was I did this is a slightly off tangent, but it goes on to the video. I made a magnetic uncoupler video back when the first iteration of my old layout had a shunting yard in it, so I effectively could still run trains around, but I had a yard I could shunt some parcels locos in, and I made a magnetic uncoupler using the KD couplings, but my own version of the magnets. And I was really chuffed with it, but it didn't do it. Like it just sort of fumbled. And I was like, I thought that would be a really interesting video. And then all of a sudden, in the last couple of weeks, loads of people have been watching it, and it suddenly popped up in my most watched of the week. But this is like a 3-year-old video. So it does work. If you go back and watch people's old videos, they do creep up, and then people start watching them and they get recommended more. So I think Go and have a look. Have a look in people's archives. James has some fantastic videos of his old 00 gauge layouts, and I still, to this day, maintain he should have persevered with that layout because it looked beautiful from what I had seen of it. And watching these older videos might help. If you want to find a video and you can't find it, ask myself or James for it because we'll happily send you the link, and then hopefully more and more people watch it, and it pushes us to then push out more videos about these particular topics that people want to see. My most viewed video on my YouTube channel has always been and constantly is my fiddle yard episodes, because we've spoken about how people ignore the idea of fiddle yards, and showing people how to build them is quite handy.
Yeah, that's it. Go back and have a look. I think that covers us for today. So we'll take a little break, and when we come back, we'll do our social media shout outs. Hello there, dear listener. We thought we'd just take a moment to talk to you about our Patreon. For the last few weeks, Sam has been putting out an advert impersonating David Attenborough, trying to entice you to give us your money. And you were right not to do it. But now we ask you from the bottom of our hearts to follow us on Patreon.
If you do want to support us in what we do, and you believe that what we do is good enough that you want a part of your money, you can find us on Patreon, and you can start donating for as little as $1 a month. It's in dollars, it's in freedom credits, however you want to say it, but eventually it will just take the pounds from your bank account. And if you do want to support James and myself, head on over to Patreon. There's varying levels and tiers that you can do, and there's even a tier where I'll weather stuff for you and James gets the benefit of it. So why not support us on Patreon today?
Indeed. And that way we can get new microphones so you can stop complaining that you can't hear us. Okay, so that was our little chat about weathering, and hopefully it's inspired you to maybe go look at a video or have a go yourself, or even contact a weathering company if you don't feel confident enough to do it. But I don't know anyone you could contact for that, so we'll leave that there, I suppose, eh, Sam?
Yeah, probably for the best. Make sure you find yourself someone reputable, not a charlatan who hangs out at model railway shows pretending that they've been invited.
Look at that.
On the back of that, I will be at shows this year, and something I do at shows, if you're new here, something I do is when I go to shows, because I'm set up for the weekend, I don't charge my usual rates for airbrush weathering at a show. I do it much cheaper than if you got it done in sort of a usual time. So if you do fancy getting something weathered and at a reasonable cost that doesn't break the bank but still makes it worth my while, you can catch me at various shows over the course of this year. Apart from the one I forgot to shout out a couple of weeks ago, I do usually notify people that I'll be going to shows. I will be at the New Forest later this year. I will be at Chatham, and I'm going to keep calling it Chatham. And there's a couple of shows that I'm waiting for confirmations on. I'll also be at a one-day Guildford show as well. So if you are interested in getting some weathering done, message me and find out what shows I'm going to be at, because you might be able to sit, and I'll happily sit and talk weathering as well. It doesn't mean that you have to. No, I always maintain nothing is hidden behind a paywall with me when it comes to weathering, and I feel like it's been a while since we've said that. But advice is free. It's the work and my time that costs money. So I'm always happy to talk weathering with anyone at a show or via Instagram if you want to drop me a message.
Yeah, there we are. So talking of shows, shall we have a look at the exhibition calendar?
Yes, let's.
Lovely stuff. So then we're venturing into March already, because at the end of this week, on the weekend, it will be Saturday the 1st of March. And we are starting at the Mid Norfolk Railway. It's the Dereham Model Railway Exhibition at the Dereham Memorial Hall in Norwich Street, Dereham, Norfolk. Also on the 1st is the Gauge Guild Spring Show at the Kettering Leisure Village in Thurston Drive, Kettering, Northamptonshire. Swindon Model Railway Club is also having the Mod Rail on the 1st of March at the Steam Museum. Firefly Avenue, Campbell Drive at Swindon, Wiltshire. So the Steam Museum is by the retail park. It's in the old Swindon Works, if you're not too familiar, but it's all accessible by train. You can just get off the station, just walk down the road there if you want to go to that one. On the Saturday 1st as well, it's the Sodbury Vale Model Railway Club 2025 exhibition. It's the club's 38th exhibition at the Yate Community Hall in Yate Parish Hall and Yate YMCA Hall, Station Road, Yate, Bristol. On the entire weekend of the 1st and the 2nd, the Abingdon and District Model Railway Club is having AbRail 2025. This is definitely expanded from what they used to host, and it's off the back of last year's very successful, I think it was their 50th anniversary exhibition. It was a very good show. This one is looking to be very good too. I'm hoping to be at that show, so you may see me there. I know we'll see our good friend Tom there. He's going to be there with Bubbles Kelly, so you can get a few bits from him. Also on that weekend then is the Mount Tabor Models European Railways New Items Event 2025 at the Cromford Community Centre, 7 to 9 Marketplace, Cromford, Derbyshire. Keighley Model Railway Club is having their 2025 exhibition at the Woodbank Garden Centre and Nursery at Harden Road in Harden, West Yorkshire. Nottingham Model Railway Society 2025 Spring Show at St John's Church Hall, Nottingham Road, Hucknall, Nottinghamshire. The Middereen expedition of the Midlands Garden Rail Show will be held at the Warwickshire Event Centre at the Fossway Leamington Spa, Warwickshire. The Mansfield St Peter's Model Railway Group is having the Mansfield Model Railway exhibition at St Peter's Church Centre, Churchside, Mansfield, Nottinghamshire. The Preston District Model Railway Society is having the Preston Model Railway exhibition at the Sports Hall at Preston's College, St Vincent's Road, Fulwood, Preston, Lancashire. The Ranhill Model Railway Club is having Model Rail 2025, Ranhill High School at Warrington Road in Ranhill, Merseyside. There's the Redditch Model Railway Club Limited 52nd Redditch Model Railway Exhibition at Trinity High School, Grove Street, Redditch, Worcestershire. Romsey and District Railway Model Society is having their 45th annual exhibition at the Crossfield Hall in Broadwater Road in Romsey, Hampshire. And on Sunday the 2nd, there's the Chesham Model Railway Club Annual Exhibition 2025, Whitehill Centre at Whitehill, Chesham, Buckinghamshire. The Junction 72A Model Railway Club Open Day at St Catherine's Priory, St Catherine's Road, Exeter and Devon. And on Sunday the 2nd as well is Chris Crafts and Model Railways at Plymouth Model Railway Show, St Boniface Catholic College at St Boniface Lane, Plymouth, Devon. And that is all for this up and coming weekend. You can definitely tell that the Model Railway exhibitions is getting into full swing now. So plenty to choose from for this weekend.
Yeah, there's a lot. The Romsey show does sound tempting, although, yeah, it does sound tempting.
There you go, plenty to choose from. The Swindon one sounded quite good as well. There's a lot of 009 going to be at the Swindon one, but it's I got to make my choice really. It's go to Abingdon or go to Swindon.
That is a tough call.
It is. I don't think I'll get away with going both over the weekend and sort of do the Swindon on the Saturday and the Abingdon on the Sunday. But,
Not unless you take both kids with you.
the girl wouldn't want to come. She's not so into trains. Right. Social media shout out time, Sam. What have you got for us this week?
This week, I'm going to be shouting out Gowerton Parkway. It's a beautiful, beautiful layout, and it's just nice watching the videos and seeing all of the loco stock that runs around. A lot of EWS stuff on here as well. But yeah, definitely worth a shout out. Go and give Gowerton Parkway on both Instagram and YouTube a follow.
His layouts is one of those very I'd say niche eras of the late 90s to early 2000 period that doesn't get modelled very often.
Yeah.
But it's that lovely sort of transition between BR, as you say, to the EWS period. So there's sort of a lot of variety of livery there, if not so much a variety of locomotives. Obviously, some of the members of certain classes have been withdrawn by that point, but still, yeah, but worthy of going to have a look. Now, mine's not really a social media shout out. I'm throwing a curveball in here. I'm venturing off into a completely different direction. And the story goes as this. Back in 2020, I was listening, I think maybe, but probably BBC Six Music, and there was a song played on there, and it was called Class 87, Coventry to Euston, 1988, possibly. I put it in my notes on my phone to investigate this curious song and this musician that's created this song and why it was given such a title. And there it sat in my notes for a good 5 years until I went in there the other night, had a look, saw it, and went, I remember that. I'm going to find out more about this band. And I did. So it's Cyclismo. And it's quite a difficult one to Google as well, because if you put it in there, you'll get a lot of biking stuff.
We don't want that.
It is. I've got Amazon Music. I found it on Amazon Music. The album is on there, and the album is called Blue and Gray, Incomplete History of British Railways. And it's 10 tracks of, they're just musical interludes. There's no lyrics or anything like that. It's nothing usually in my style of heavy rock music. It's more of some of it's piano, some of it's electronic sort of dance kind of music. It does feel very 80s and 90s. The first track is HSD Exeter to Newton Abbot 1990, and it goes on like that. Class 50 Waterloo to Exeter 1989. I found it a very interesting concept of an album. I thought it was quite curious as well, and the fact it was all just railway themed spiked my interest, and I've had listened to it, and I thought, you know what, give it a go. You may just enjoy it. You might think it's a load of old rubbish, but that's my shout out for the meet. So yeah, it's Cyclismo and Blue and Grey, an Incomplete History of British Railways. Well, last week we didn't do our shout outs, and then I got told off for doing that. So Sam, how can people find you?
If you want to find me, tell me I'm a good little Southern boy. You can find me on Instagram at emperors_path. Alternatively, you can find me on YouTube. James, if people want to get hold of you, how can they do it?
Well, if you want to find me, I am Western Sigmund on YouTube with a new 009 video series appearing weekly at the moment. I'm not guaranteeing that's going to be weekly forever. I do have other things to do. But for the moment, there's a video come up every week. And you can also find me on Instagram as Western Sigmund. Don't email me. I still can't get into that account. I don't know what to do about that, really. Probably should just get rid of it. And yeah, don't forget that the Model Rail Replacement Podcast is available on Instagram. So come find us on there as the Model Rail Replacement Podcast. And if you want to email us, it's modelrailrp, that's Romeo Papa, at outlook.com. And just to make you aware, we are going to look in starting a Model Rail Replacement Podcast YouTube channel. Mostly because I've discovered that the podcast kills my other videos. So we want something a little bit more separate. So be aware that if you are listening to us on YouTube, we are going to eventually move over to its own dedicated channel. So you may just want to look out for that. Apart from that, then, that ties us up for today. All I can say is that hopefully we've been entertaining, informative, and have replaced your model railway, if only just for a little bit. I've been James, and with me has been Sam. Thank you for listening.
This service terminates here. Please ensure you take all of your personal belongings with you.